You didn't stay by accident. Something in you already knew this moment was coming. There's a quiet familiarity in being here. Not excitement, not urgency, just recognition, like arriving somewhere you've been before, but only now noticing it. This isn't about learning anything, you can feel that already. It's more like noticing what's been hovering at the edge of your attention for a while now. The pauses that started showing up in your thoughts, the way silence stopped feeling empty, the subtle distance between who you are and who you thought you needed to be. Nothing dramatic happened, no clear moment to point to, and yet something softened. You might have called it waiting, or being stuck, or even losing motivation. But underneath those words there was something else, a neutrality you couldn't quite explain, a sense that pushing didn't make sense anymore, but neither did going backward. You weren't lost, you were between, and somehow you stayed. That's what makes this feel relevant now. Not because something is about to happen, but because something already settled. You didn't rush to label it. You didn't announce it. You just kept living, watching, adjusting without trying to. That quiet adjustment matters more than it looks. At some point, effort stopped feeling like progress. And you noticed, without judging it, you may have felt less reactive lately. Not numb, just less pulled. Conversations land differently. Old triggers don't hook the same way. Plans feel lighter, less urgent. It's not that you don't care, it's that caring doesn't grip you the way it used to. And if you tried to explain this to someone, the words probably wouldn't cooperate, so you didn't. You let it remain unnamed. That choice, one whether conscious or not, kept something intact. There's a reason this phase doesn't announce itself, and later that reason will feel obvious, even though nothing about it needs to be explained now. Time has been behaving strangely, hasn't it? Days move quickly, but decisions don't feel rushed. Weeks pass, yet some inner questions dissolve on their own. You may have noticed that clarity now arrives quietly, not as answers, more like the absence of conflict. Things don't click, they settle, and the settling doesn't demand attention. It just changes how you move through ordinary moments. You still do what you do, you still show up, but there's less friction inside the doing. Almost as if you're no longer negotiating with yourself every step of the way. That shift isn't loud enough to celebrate, but it's steady enough to trust. You didn't decide to let go, you realized you already had. There's often a phase where awareness arrives after the fact, where life adjusts first and understanding follows later. This is one of those phases. You may feel like you're catching up to yourself, reading old thoughts and not recognizing the person who wrote them. Revisiting old desires and wondering why they once felt urgent. Nothing is wrong with that. It's just alignment changing shape, and alignment doesn't ask for effort. It reveals effort that's no longer needed. You might have expected fireworks, a breakthrough moment, something that felt like arrival. Instead, what came was subtle, a gentler pace inside your own mind, a quieter relationship with time. You're still in motion, but you're no longer chasing the motion. That difference changes everything, without changing anything obvious. You may not fully understand what's happening yet, but you're no longer confused by the fact that something has happened, and that's enough for now. Reality has always been responsive, not as reward, not as punishment, as reflection. When perception shifts, experience reorganizes, quietly, without asking permission, without explanation. You don't wake up to a new world. You wake up seeing the same world differently. And suddenly what once felt heavy feels neutral. What once felt distant feels familiar. What once demanded effort simply unfolds. Not because you changed reality, but because you stopped arguing with your position inside it. At some point, the mirror stopped surprising you. You may notice that identity feels looser now, not fragile, just less rigid. You're not clinging to versions of yourself anymore, not defending them, not trying to prove them. You're allowing yourself to be slightly undefined. That's not confusion, that's space. And in that space, perception widens without pressure. You don't need to replace who you were. You simply stop rehearsing them. Later, you'll recognize this part as the moment effort quietly stepped aside, even though it didn't feel important at the time. There's a collective quality to this, even if it feels personal. Many people are moving through similar quiet thresholds, not together, but in parallel. Not talking about it much, not organizing around it, just noticing that the old urgency doesn't fit anymore. The path doesn't disappear, It refines. Choice becomes clearer, not because there are fewer options, but because fewer of them feel misaligned. You're not narrowing your life, you're filtering noise. Clarity didn't arrive as certainty, it arrived as ease. You may still have moments of doubt. That doesn't contradict anything. Doubt now passes through instead of settling in. It visits. It doesn't move in. That's how you know something foundational has shifted. The ground feels stable enough to let questions come and go, and you don't rush to answer them. There's a version of you that already knows where this leads, not intellectually, experientially. You're not becoming that version, you're aligning with it. And alignment doesn't feel like striving. It feels like recognition, like remembering the posture your awareness prefers. You don't need to understand the whole path. You only need to notice that you're walking it differently. If you pause for a moment, you might notice how little effort it takes now to stay present with yourself. Some people explore this recognition further through writing or reflection or quiet study. For others, it shows up in books that don't teach. They mirror. Parallel realities exists in that space, not as an explanation, more like a continuation of this same inner conversation in another form. It doesn't add anything. It simply stays with what's already here. Nothing new was added. Something unnecessary was released. You may have noticed how time feels less linear now. Moments loop. Insights revisit themselves from different angles. The past doesn't pull as hard. The future doesn't shout as loudly. You're here, not because you chose to be, but because nothing else competes for your attention anymore. That's not discipline. That's alignment. Soon, this phase will feel so natural that you'll forget it ever felt subtle. And when that happens, you'll understand why it couldn't have been rushed. There may be parts of your life already responding to this shift, without you consciously touching them. You don't need to track progress. Progress is tracking you. The field you're in now responds to awareness, not force. To perception, not pressure. That's why things unfold when you're not watching them too closely. That's why effort softened first, before results ever showed up. What's aligned doesn't need to announce itself. There's no finish line here, no moment where this becomes complete. It keeps unfolding in quiet ways, in ordinary conversations, in choices that feel obvious instead of heavy. You didn't miss anything, you didn't fall behind, you didn't arrive late. You stayed long enough to notice. And that's why this feels familiar instead of new. You're not waiting for the shift anymore. You're living inside its aftertaste. And even after this video ends, that awareness doesn't stop. It keeps moving, keeps adjusting, keeps recognizing itself without needing words. There was a moment, maybe subtle enough to overlook, when you stopped asking what was wrong with you. Not because everything suddenly made sense, but because the question itself lost urgency. You still noticed patterns, still reflected, still observed yourself moving through days that looked ordinary from the outside. But something inside you relaxed its grip on figuring it out. You weren't fixing anymore. You were witnessing. And witnessing doesn't feel productive. It feels quiet, almost passive, which is why many people mistake this phase for stagnation. But you didn't. Even if you couldn't articulate why, you sensed that pushing here would only distort something delicate. So you stayed, not frozen, not drifting, just present enough to let things reorganize without interference. You didn't stop moving forward, you stopped forcing direction. It's strange how identity softens in moments like this, not disappearing, not dissolving, just loosening its edges. You still recognize yourself, but you're no longer trapped inside a single version. Roles feel lighter, labels feel optional. You can step into them when needed, and step out without resistance. That flexibility wasn't learned, it emerged. And when it did, reality adjusted its tone around you. Less friction, less resistance, less need to prove continuity. You're allowed to change without announcing it. There's often a quiet loneliness in this stage, not the painful kind, the neutral kind, because you can't fully explain where you are and you don't need others to follow. You're not ahead, you're not behind. You're simply aligned with a timing that doesn't rush. And timing like that feels invisible until you notice how little you're struggling against it. You may still wonder if something should be happening, but you no longer feel anxious about the answer. Some days, awareness feels almost ordinary, too ordinary to be meaningful, until you remember how noisy it used to be inside, the constant checking, the internal commentary. the pressure to interpret every feeling as a signal. That noise faded gradually. So gradually that only silence made it noticeable. And silence isn't empty here, it's spacious. Peace didn't arrive. Tension quietly exited. You might notice now how quickly you recalibrate. Something happens, you feel it, and then it passes. No spiral, no narrative construction. Just experience, moving through. That's not emotional distance. That's emotional efficiency. You're not suppressing, you're not bypassing, you're processing in real time. And that changes how the field around you responds. There's a point where awareness stops leaning forward, not pulling back, not advancing, just settling into its own balance. You might have noticed this as a strange neutrality toward outcomes, not indifference, more like trust without optimism. Things matter, but they don't cling. You show up, respond, choose, yet there's less internal bargaining attached to each move. As if some deeper part of you already understands that the path doesn't need to be negotiated moment by moment. It's already responding. You didn't lose ambition, you lost friction. What changed wasn't what you want, it was how tightly you hold it. Desire became quieter, cleaner, no longer tangled with urgency or identity. You may still envision futures, still imagine possibilities, but they don't feel like escape routes anymore. They feel like directions, optional, flexible, alive. You're not chasing versions of yourself, you're allowing them to meet you where you are. That's why movement feels more natural now. There's also a subtle honesty that comes with this phase. You notice when something isn't aligned, and you don't dramatize it. No internal trial, no self-correction spiral. You simply see it and adjust, quietly. That simplicity is new, not because life got easier, but because perception stopped complicating it. You may still question where this is leading, but you trust how it's unfolding. Sometimes this shows up as patience you didn't cultivate. You just found yourself inside it. Waiting no longer feels like delay, it feels like part of motion. And motion doesn't always announce itself as action. Sometimes it shows up as readiness. Stillness didn't stop progress, and it clarified it. You might notice how little explanation you need now, not just for others, for yourself. You don't require a story to justify where you are, or why you're choosing what you're choosing. The need to make sense softened. Meaning didn't disappear. It stopped demanding language. And in that quiet, something steady emerged. Not certainty, orientation. There's a version of you that's no longer waiting for permission, not from the world, not from time, not even from understanding. You're already participating, even when nothing seems to be happening. There's a phase where even reflection slows down. You're not analyzing your experience as much anymore, not tracking it, not checking if it means something. You're inside it, and being inside something feels very different from observing it. You may notice this when you realize you haven't been thinking about yourself as often. Not in a distracted way, in a settled way. The inner commentary softened, the constant self-referencing quieted, not gone, just no longer central. And that shift changes the entire field of experience. You didn't disappear from your own life. You stopped standing in front of it. It's subtle how perception reorganizes when it's no longer wrapped around identity. Moments feel fuller without being intense. Choices feel clearer without being rigid. You respond more than you react, and when you do react, it resolves faster. There's less residue. That alone frees a surprising amount of internal space. Space you didn't know was being occupied until it emptied. At times, this phase can feel strangely unremarkable. No highs, no dramatic lows, just continuity. And for a mind trained to measure progress through contrast, continuity can feel like nothing is happening. But something is. It's just not demanding attention anymore. You might sense that what's unfolding now won't be obvious until later, and oddly, that doesn't bother you. There's a quiet confidence that emerges here. Not the expressive kind, not the visible kind, the kind that doesn't need reinforcement. You trust your internal calibration more. Even when you can't explain why something feels right or finished, you don't rush to reopen doors that already closed themselves, and you don't force new ones to appear. You move with what's responsive. Certainty didn't arrive, resistance faded. This is often where people think they've plateaued, but a plateau still implies effort reaching a limit. What's happening here is different. Effort stepped aside and perception recalibrated. You're no longer leaning toward the future for validation, and you're no longer pulling the past forward for reference. You're meeting experience where it is, without commentary. That changes how time feels. Not faster, not slower, less pressurized. There's also a quiet grief that may pass through here. Not sadness, recognition. You may notice how much energy once went into becoming, into maintaining coherence, into holding a story together. And you don't judge that version of yourself. You simply don't inhabit it anymore. There's a moment when you realize this was never just about you, not in a dramatic way, not in a dissolving into the whole way, more quietly than that. You notice that what you're experiencing doesn't feel isolated. It feels shared, even if no one around you is talking about it. The same soft detachment, the same recalibration, the same sense that something important already happened, and life is simply adjusting its posture around it. You don't need proof of this. You feel it in how familiar this state is when you encounter it in others, in the pauses between words, in the lack of urgency behind certain conversations. It's subtle, but it's there. What feels personal is often just where the field touches you. There's a strange relief in realizing you're not late to anything. That the sense of catching up isn't failure, it's how awareness moves. Experience leads, understanding follows, always has. You don't wake up before the shift, you wake up inside it, and then, slowly, you remember how you got there. You may notice that the idea of a next step doesn't hold the same weight, not because nothing is coming, but because movement no longer needs to be framed as progression. Life isn't lining up milestones for you anymore. It's responding in real time. Small adjustments, subtle mirrors, quiet confirmations that don't ask to be celebrated, and you recognize them, not as signs, but as reflections. You don't feel like you're waiting anymore. You feel like you're inhabiting a pause that's doing something. There's an intimacy with the present here, not the intense, mindful kind, the ordinary kind, washing a cup, answering a message, standing still for a few extra seconds without checking anything. Moments stop trying to justify themselves. And because of that, they feel complete. Meaning didn't deepen, it simplified. You may also notice how little you need reassurance now, not because you're certain, but because certainty isn't required for stability anymore. You're oriented, even when nothing is clear. That orientation doesn't come from belief, it comes from alignment, from not resisting where you are. And that's why this phase doesn't look impressive from the outside. It's not meant to, it's functional, it's quiet, it works. Soon even the awareness of being in a phase will fade, not because it ended, but because it integrated. It becomes background, like breathing. You don't track it, you live inside it. No finality here, no conclusion, just a sense that the conversation isn't ending, it's moving inward, and whatever comes next won't feel like a beginning. It will feel like recognition continuing in a different form. There's nothing left to point out now, not because everything was said, but because what matters isn't in the words anymore. You may notice a quiet familiarity settling as this continues. Not agreement, not understanding, recognition, like something inside you, nodding without explanation. You didn't arrive at a new idea. You returned to a position you already occupy. And once you notice that, there's no urgency to do anything with it. Life keeps moving. You keep choosing. Moments keep unfolding. But something fundamental stopped being questioned. You're not holding this awareness and it's holding you. You might forget this video later. The phrases, the pacing, that's fine. What doesn't leave is the shift in how experience lands. The way silence feels less empty. The way time feels less demanding. The way you no longer search for confirmation the way you once did. Not because you found answers, but because the question softened. There's no need to stay here longer. Nothing is being maintained. Nothing needs protection. This awareness doesn't collapse when attention moves elsewhere. It integrates. It follows you into ordinary moments, into distraction, into routine, quietly. At some point later, maybe unexpectedly, you may notice that you're responding from a different place than before. Not better, not worse, just aligned. You didn't miss the shift, you lived it first. And now, you're simply noticing where you already are. That noticing doesn't end when this ends. It continues, without commentary, without effort, like something already in motion, doing exactly what it does when it's no longer being watched.